Jubilee Cycle is an important principle of Bible prophecy, first understood by Sir Edward Denny and then developed by many other students of Scripture. It is based on a verse in Matthew where Peter asked Jesus how many times he should forgive his brother. Jesus replies, 70 times 7, which is 490 times. Matthew chapter 18, verse 21 to 22. Then came Peter to him and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times? Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. In Scripture, the word time sometimes refers to the period of a year, as in time, times, and half a time, meaning 3.5 years. Consequently, the above verse is thought by many to refer to a cycle of forgiveness or redemption that lasts 490 years. Sir Edward Denny believed that the whole of history was divided into these 490-year periods of grace. The times when God's people were in rebellion or out of fellowship are not counted in God's prophetic timeline, and the 490 redemption year periods are the periods when God's purposes are being fulfilled. For more information on Sir Edward Denny, see the website. In the 20th century, Sir Edward's ideas were taken up by Bible believers who wanted to develop them further. A.E. Ware, Frank Payne and others did a lot of work on chronology. A.E. Ware's book, The Restored Vision, and Frank Payne's Miracle of Time are both still available. They attempted to fit Sir Edward's Jubilee cycles into a calendar. Time was divided into 490-year Jubilee cycles. These periods did not include times of rebellion against God. In the Bible, the year of Jubilee was a year of cancellation of debts, and so figuratively, a year of grace and forgiveness. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. You shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. Leviticus chapter 25 verse 9 tells us that the trumpet announcing the Jubilee should be sounded on the 10th day of the 7th month. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. In other words, the Jubilee did not start at the end of the 49th year. It started in the middle approximately of the 49th year and continued to the middle of the 50th year, which was the first year of the next Jubilee cycle. This meant that while on the Hebrew calendar there were 49 years, on God's calendar there was an extra year. So for God there were 50 years, where for the Hebrews there were 49. Similarly, there were 490 years on the Hebrew calendar. There were 500 on God's calendar. This chart should help to explain it a bit. So we've got basically a 49-year cycle. This chart, so it shows year 46, 47, year 48, then year 49 on the 10th day of the 7th month. The year of Jubilee starts and it ends on the 10th day of the 7th month of the first year of the next cycle. So the year only exists on God's calendar, not on man's calendar. So on God's time there's 50 years, on man's time there's 49 years, plus the 1 Jubilee year, which is in between year 49 and year 1. And so on. A good example of how this Jubilee cycle has been used in Bible chronology can be found in Frank Payne's book, The Miracle of Time. Frank Payne was part of a small group of men who worked with Arthur Ware and built on the work of Sir Edward Denny and Grattan Guinness. They called themselves the Watchmen. One important thing about this group was that they built their chronology on the Hebrew lunar calendar of 354 days, believing this to be God's perfect calendar. In this, they differed from Sir Robert Anderson, who used a 360-day calendar for his chronology. For more information on calendars, see the website page on calendars. The Watchmen believe that there are years that God recognizes on his prophetic calendar, which are different from the years that are on any human calendar. They saw at least 4 different types of years. Firstly, God's prophetic years, which, as we've seen, include an extra year for every 49 calendar years. Secondly, scripture years, which are simply the years which we get by adding up the years recorded in scripture. Thirdly, calendar years, which do not have the extra Jubilee year that God counts. And finally, unreckoned years, the years when God's people were out of fellowship with him and which he does not recognize. So hopefully the following chart will make it a bit clearer. So the Watchmen divided time up into periods of 490 years. So, for example, the period from Adam to Abraham was 4 lots of 490 years on the human calendar, which is 1,960 years. In God's years, that's 2,000, because there's the Jubilee years added in. So on the human calendar of 1,960 years, there's 48 years that aren't counted. They're the years between the murder of Abel and the birth of Seth. The next period was the period from Abraham to Exodus, another 490 years periods. So if you look, I didn't quite explain this properly, but if you look in the column box scripture years, that if you add up the years in scripture, that period from Abraham to Exodus was 505 years, which was 490 years on the Jubilee cycle, plus 15 years between the marriage of Abraham to Hagar and the birth of Isaac, which God didn't reckon in his calendar. The next period is the period from Exodus to the dedication of Solomon's temple. This was 621 years if you just simply add up the years in scripture. It was 490 years on a Jubilee cycle, plus 131 years when Israel was under foreign rule, usually by the Philistines. The next period was from the decree of Artaxerxes to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the time of Nehemiah. That was another 490 years, 560 scripture years, so 490 plus 70 years the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon adds up to the 560 scripture years. So you can see how it works. This God's years are the Jubilee cycle years plus the Jubilee years. So there's also scripture years, which is simply the years we add up from scripture. So the lunar calendar years, which are the Jubilee years, Jubilee cycle years, added to the unreckoned years, equal the scripture years. So it takes a bit of thinking about, but it does all make sense if you can just take the time to try and figure it out. So hopefully that helped clear things up a bit. One thing to note here is that there are differences of interpretation in Bible chronology. Here we see that Frank Payne has 458 BC as the date of Artaxerxes' decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, given in Nehemiah chapter 2 verses 1 to 8. Sir Robert Anderson dated the same decree in 445 BC. So you can see that in Bible prophecy, things aren't always clear-cut. There are disagreements about dates. We have to kind of try and stick with the basic principles. Another issue is the use of the 354-day lunar year. Frank Payne in a Watchman arrived at the date of 1933 AD as the final year of the 6,000 years of God's timeline prior to the 1,000-year millennium. Now, clearly, the millennium didn't start in 1933 AD. And maybe that was because they were using that 354-day lunar year calendar. For more information, see the section on the final hour and Arthur Ware on the website. They took Christ's crucifixion as being 4,000 of God's years from creation, or 3,920 lunar calendar years, and added 2,000 of God's years to it. That's 1,960 lunar calendar years. 1,960 times 354 is 693,840 days. To get that period in solar years, you divide by 365.2422, which comes to about 1,900 years. Adding 1,900 years to their crucifixion date of 33 AD comes to 1933 AD. And we may laugh that they came up with that date as the final year of the 6,000 years, because we know that the millennium didn't start on that date. But there is a bit more to the story, because that was the year of the first ever World Economic Forum, and many people believe that this was a kind of crucial date when mankind came together almost in rebellion against God, in the belief that they could fix their own problems. Anyway, it's an interesting story, and you can follow it up on the website if you want to. Arthur Ware and the Watchman had originally been inspired to study God's prophetic timeline by conviction that the armistice of 1918, being on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, was a sign from God that mankind was nearing its final hour. I think that Frank Payne, who was one of the Watchmen, did have a lot of insight into God's plan of time, and as if to mark this, he died in 1983 in the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. You can get all this information on the Prophecy Workshop website. Thank you very much for listening.